sounds listening to poetry. We need to remember that poetry is our oldest literary genre. It again predates history. And so poetry has always been crafted to be sung or to be spoken. And if you remember, in ancient civilizations, long before there was history, in those prehistoric civilizations, there, in all walks of life, in civilizations and tribes and in cultures, there was one person, generally, who was responsible for chronicling, for singing, for chanting a people's history and passing that lore, that knowledge down from one generation to the other. That person was called the Bard, B-A-R-D. Do you remember that? Well, a particular type of poem can be referred to as a ballad, and a ballad tells its audience a story. And the ballad would be sung from one generation to the other for entertainment, but also sometimes for instruction. The literary ballad is a narrative poem written to imitate those old anonymous folk ballads, and probably one of the most famous of those that I can think of off the top of my head is called A Ballad of Birmingham by Dudley Randall, which was written in the late 1960s, I think 69, and it chronicled the bombing that happened in Birmingham amid the civil rights crisis. In considering poetry as sound, though, we should never forget that poetry traces its beginnings to song. Listen as I read Piano Player by John Updike. Player Piano by John Updike. My stick fingers click with a snicker, and chuckling they knuckle the keys. Light-footed, my steel feelers flicker and pluck from these keys melodies. My paper can caper, abandon is broadcast by dint of my din, and no man or band has a hand in the tones I turn on from within. At times I'm a jumble of rumbles, at others I'm light like the moon, but never my numb plunker fumbles, misstrums me, or tries a new tune. Okay, so I'm not the greatest reader of poetry, but if you think I'm bad, you should try to listen to Robert Frost read his poetry. Now, I'm a big Robert Frost fan, but boy, he was an awful reader. And if you don't believe me, just go to YouTube or Google Robert Frost reading his poetry and have a listen. You'll be begging me to read the poems. So poets rely on a number of strategies to imbue their poems with musicality. The first big term is a doozy if you have to spell it. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to spell it. But it's pronounced onomatopoeia. And an onomatopoeia relates to words that resemble the sound it denotes. Or in other words, the word sounds like the word it's supposed to represent. So these are words like buzz, squeak, sizzle, pow, bang. This is onomatopoeia because the words themselves create the sounds that they're trying to represent. Does that make sense? Here's a big term, though, alliteration, and this is one you need to be familiar with. Any study of poetry, particularly when you're looking at the musical quality that a poem can create, alliteration is one of the big terms that we often look for. Alliteration is the repetition of identical consonant sounds at the beginning of words that are in close proximity to one another. So the first example comes from Channel Firing by the poet Thomas Hardy. Just a quick line. All nations striving strong to make red wars yet redder. This is an example of alliteration. You should pick up on the striving strong, that consonantal cluster of STR in striving and then strong. Those two words represent or illustrate alliteration because you get that consonant repetition in two words side by side, and then maybe even the red and redder. You get the R consonant sound. The second example is from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Just a quick Excerpt. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrowed followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. Right? So you can hear, right, the repetition of those consonants. The foam flew, the breeze blew, furrowed followed free, the first that ever burst, silent sea, the S repetition there, right? And it's not just in poetry. You'll hear it in people's names. Ronald Reagan, Marilyn Monroe, Sammy Sosa, right? We can remember those names because, or one of the reasons we remember them so is because of that alliteration. And marketers use it as well. Dunkin' Donuts, Krispy Kreme. Well, now I'm hungry, right? So look for alliteration as you're driving through town and reading the signs, because alliteration will always create a musical effect that enhances the pleasure of reading and makes things more memorable, especially when you had to recite it as those ancient bards had to. Very closely related to alliteration is the term assonance. And assonance is the repetition of the same or identical vowel sounds in words that are in close proximity to one another. Here are a couple closing stanzas from Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy winds and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So as with alliteration, poets use assonance to create music effect by creating internal rhyme, which may be pleasant, and if that internal rhyme that we sometimes hear in a line of poetry is pleasant, in other words, it doesn't grate our ears, that's referred to as euphony. Or if it's unpleasant, cacophony, which is a great word. I just like to say it. Either way, these choices enhance the pleasure of reading poetry and prose. You'll find alliteration and assonance in prose fiction and prose writing as well. It's not something that's specific or unique to poetry. When it comes to techniques that poets have to create the musical effect in their poetry, the term rhyme is probably the term that you're most familiar with for poets to create sound patterns in their poetry. Words like deep and sleep, like we heard in Robert Frost's poem, right? The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have miles to go before I sleep. So deep and sleep, make and flake. These words chime together or rhyme together. While words are often spelled alike, like eep and eep and the deep and sleep, the EEP, it's not a requirement for words to rhyme. So they don't have to be spelled alike, they have to sound alike. So tough, for example, can rhyme with bluff or buff for that matter. What is important for true rhyme is for the sound the words make when spoken. That's what we're listening for when we're listening for rhyme. Rhyme can be identified as end rhyme when it comes at the end of the lines. That's pretty easy to remember. You look to the end of the lines and try to find where whether or not the lines rhyme. Sometimes there's an alternating rhyme scheme, right, where every other line rhymes. Hey, that rhymed. Every other line rhymed. Or there's internal rhyme, when at least one of the rhymed words is placed within the line of poetry. So the internal rhyme just happens within the same line of poetry. I'm not going to ask or require you to identify masculine or feminine rhyme patterns. I think that's getting a little too granular, a little too specific for what we're doing in this class. But I will ask you to be familiar with exact rhyme, which is like tough and buff or deep and sleep. That's exact or true rhyme. And then the term near rhyme, or as I learned it in school, we would refer to it as slant rhyme. Slant rhyme is when usually the poet changes the vowels between two words that otherwise might rhyme. So look at this example, send and sand, right? So the consonants pretty much stay the same, the S, the N, and the D, but the poet changes that vowel between the two words, send and sand. Those are what I would call slant rhymes, or blind and blonde. The words aren't a true, they're not an exact rhyme, but they slant, or they're near. And again, typically the slanting or the near rhyme is achieved by keeping the consonants in place but changing the vowel. Pretty cool. So just a few parting thoughts. Can you believe it? We're already done. That's fantastic. This is a shorter presentation. A few parting thoughts. As you read through the poems in this chapter, keep an eye out, or rather keep an ear out for some of these musical devices and some of these musical strategies that poets have, alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia, and so forth. Read these poems out loud. You can read them outside too. That'd be great. And enjoy the music. Enjoy the sound of the words coming out of your mouth, okay? Because poetry is meant to be read. And here are a couple other thoughts too. While the presence of rhyme is certainly a part of the tradition of poetry, not all poems are rhymed. And in America, at least, this begins to change around 1855 when Walt Whitman publishes Leaves of Grass in the middle of the 19th century. And Whitman is among the first of the American poets to challenge the conventions of poetry. In other words, challenging those traditions of poetry. And of course, one of the chief ones was that poetry should rhyme. And Whitman began to write in free verse. The French were doing this as well, and they referred to it as verse libre. So I wanted you to keep that in mind. Not all poetry is or has to rhyme. In fact, some of the worst poems that I've ever read, one of the things I could say about them is that they were in fact rhymed. So just because something's rhymed doesn't really make it a good poem, okay? In fact, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, referred to Edgar Allan Poe as that jingle man, right? And he was kind of taking a swipe at Poe's poetry and the way it kind of jingled along and was so sing-songy, right? And in fact, I think it's the 1840s, Emerson writes that famous essay of his, The Poet, and Emerson was a little disappointed in the American landscape with regards to poetry and literature. And Emerson was looking around and seeing that and observing that we never had yet to really, America had yet to create a true poet. The poet with a capital P, somebody who was, England had its Shakespeare, had Milton, had Chaucer, the ancients, had Ovid, the Italians had Dante, and so forth. And so what had America created with regards to poetry? And Emerson was sad. He was lamenting. He was looking around and seeing people like Longfellow and Holmes and other William Cullen Bryant, and he was even counting himself as a poet among the shortcomings and the failures of American poetry. And somewhere along in that essay, he makes this statement that talent may frolic and juggle, genius realizes and adds. So the first part of that sentence, talent may frolic and juggle, speaks specifically to that ability to craft poems that are traditional and that they rhyme and they have the same pattern and meter. Emerson was saying, yeah, that takes talent to do that, but doesn't necessarily constitute or illustrate any kind of poetic genius. And so what Emerson was saying, that the poet that he was looking for was somebody who would do more than that, who would realize new concepts and articulate them and contribute them in a new, fresh, innovative, meaningful way. And folks, Walt Whitman was that poet. Okay, so something for you to think about. And I hope that you're able to take some classes on campus. And if you do, I would love to have you in my American Literature class. Let me give you a plug for both of those. I teach English 251 and 252 in a classroom, and we do it old school, and we do it upright. And I would love to have you in my class. So I hope that you'll think about that. And if your schedules allow, just always know that you're more than welcome, and I'd love to have you. See you next time.